In the studio by Ambassador Arun Singh. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on this broadcast on Wion. We're also joined by Mr. Vivek Katju, another former ambassador of India. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Katju, for joining us. Ambassador Singh, let me begin by asking you on this. We saw the meeting between India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Donald Trump. And, you know, it appeared to be a very friendly kind of a meeting. There were some contentious issues that were not touched upon. For instance, the purchase of the S-400 missiles with Russia. What do you make of this, considering the fact that just before he started off for this G20 summit, the US president appeared to be in not exactly this kind of a very friendly mood, looking at his tweets?
Well, President Trump has waxed and waned in terms of public articulation on India. But at the same time, in his administration, aside from the differences on trade issues, on all other issues, they've moved positively.
Right.
For instance, they've initiated what is referred to as the 2+2 dialogue, which is involving the foreign and defense ministers of the two countries. And it is the first time we did at this level with any country. And the US initiated that. They've offered supply of high-tech equipment to India. It was in his administration that India was placed under what was called STA-1 authorization,
right.
Strategic Trade Authorization Level 1, which allows high technologies to flow to India on levels that the US gives to its other partners and allies. So in that sense, aside from the differences on trade, things have moved positively with the US. And of course, President Trump, as we discussed, has waxed and waned in terms of the public articulation. So I think this meeting was important because face-to-face direct engagement between President Trump and our Prime Minister has not been so frequent. And last time they met was at the G20 in Buenos Aires.
Right.
But that was also in the format of a trilateral with the Japanese Prime Minister. So this was after a fairly long gap, that a bilateral meeting. So that's important. And I think US also felt that aside from doing a trilateral with Japan as a message in the context of Indo-Pacific, it was important to do a bilateral with the Prime Minister because he had just been re-elected with a fairly strong mandate. So that was the message. And before this meeting, the US Secretary of State Pompeo specifically made a visit to India to engage with the Indian leadership. So I think the signal from the US is very clear that despite the differences that...
but there are conflicting signals as well from the United States. Let me also take that across to Ambassador Katju here. Ambassador, the fact of the matter is we saw the tweet that Donald Trump put out. He said that India is, of course, increasing tariffs. But when he met with Prime Minister Narendra Modi a little while back, what he said was something very different. He said that we've become great friends, our countries have never been closer, and I can say this with surety that we will work together in many ways, including in military. Now, how are we to read this? Donald Trump, of course, does his diplomacy using two methods. One is his tweeting and the other are tariffs. So what should we be taking more seriously in terms of what he's talking on tariffs or in terms of the exchange that he's had with the Prime Minister earlier this morning?
No, I think the atmospherics of this meeting were very good. It could hardly be expected that they would be otherwise. The two leaders are meeting after Modi's great electoral victory, and naturally Trump would not ruffle him at this stage. But the US is pursuing its global agenda. When India fits within that global agenda, things are fine. But when India does not come within the global agenda of the US, that is the question, that is the area that we really have to focus on, and whether the US is willing to make some kind of accommodation or adjustments with Indian interests in these areas. Let's take Iran, for instance. In Iran, as far as connectivity is concerned, the US seems to have allowed a waiver because it is in the interest of the United States to have greater connectivity to Afghanistan.
Right.
But when it comes to oil, which is part of the American agenda to squeeze Iran, then there is no give. Now it's a different matter that I believe that for India, purchase of Iran oil is not within a core interest area, and therefore we can diversify our sources. But we'll have to see really what they do on the S-400s, because that is an area where it is squarely within India's core interest to purchase S-400s, and the Americans have a new law in that regard, CARTA, and we've got to see whether they will be willing to make a waiver. They've been speaking equivocally in this regard. So let's go by American actions on the ground instead of public statements, including tweets. I'm not concerned with tweets or public statements, but I see actions.
Ambassador Katju, my point, of course, was
a vast area.
Ambassador Katju, my point was, although on the face of it, there appears to be a lot of rapport and camaraderie between the two leaders, the fact of the matter is, each country follows its individual interest. Now, the United States has been asking India to cut off its ties with Iran.
Absolutely.
It's been asking India not to go ahead with the S-400 missile deal. And this is, in fact, telling India as to how to conduct diplomacy. Do you not think that there are certain sticking points that need to be ironed out between the two nations?
Of course, there are sticking points that need to be ironed out, but the question is, in the ironing out of these points, one has to examine core areas and non-core areas or peripheral areas where one can make some concessions. And that is where on Iranian oil purchases, I believe that we can make compromises, but on S-400s, I do believe we can't. It is two other points here. One, that there is a vast area of cooperation between India and the United States, and Arun rightly mentioned high technology. I think the American steps allowing freer flows of high technology to India are most welcome and indicative of their desire to upgrade the relationship. This is also a welcome measure. But in areas such as, for example, the 5G question, in areas relating to localization of data, on these areas we'll have to navigate our way through, ensuring that our core interests are safeguarded.
Absolutely.
So this is the diplomatic game, and this is how it is played. I think we are playing it fairly well.
I think that's an important point that you've raised. Let me take that across to Ambassador Singh. Now, the fact of the matter is, in this meeting, although there was a bilateral, we discussed several issues with the Americans, but we did not discuss the S-400 missile deal. And this is a clear sticking point, because the Americans have said that, look, there is no possibility of exemptions at this point of time. And I also want you to weigh in on the similar kind of a difference that America has over the S-400 deal with Turkey, which is a NATO ally. Do you think the Americans would be willing to make concession on this?
We'll have to wait and see. And clearly, there was no need to raise the S-400 issue at this stage. So there is an American law.
Right.
And and although now there is a waiver provision given to the U.S. president under U.S. law, the U.S. has indicated that right now, they do not need to make any assessment.
Right.
That whether or not they have to resort to any measure under U.S. law will take place when there is actually a significant transaction taking place. So there's no point raising this issue at this stage. And so
the fact that it was not even discussed is not
so if you discuss now, nothing will happen. Because the U.S. will say, well, there's nothing to do now, our law is there, and under law requires this, and we would like that India not buy it. But there's no specific action that is due now. So there's no point raising this, because this is an issue that has been discussed with the U.S. from time to time. And this was not really the time, because nothing will come out of it. So the question, and U.S. has signaled in their various comments that they will not indicate how they will proceed until the time comes when they have to take a decision. Because they also want to maintain the ambiguity. They want to sustain the pressure from their point of view without indicating which way they will go. And from India's point of view, as Vivek also said, this is clearly a core area, and this is an area where we cannot compromise. But since the issue is not ready for any action, there's no point raising it now. And I think that's why, in terms of what the Prime Minister articulated publicly, the issues that India focused on were different. Defense, security issues, technology issues, issues related to 5G, issues related to Iran, which were more immediate in terms of actions that need to be taken.
Well, we'll discuss more on this. Meanwhile, my colleague Siddhant Sibil is presently in Osaka and is tracking all the developments very closely for us. Is also joining us from them. Good afternoon to you, Siddhant, because it is afternoon in Osaka. We saw India's Prime Minister have a very busy schedule earlier this morning. He's met with US President Donald Trump. He's also met with the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He's also got a number of other meetings slated towards the afternoon. Give us a sense of what's in fact unfolding in this very crucial day at the G20 summit today there.
Well, just a short while ago, the Foreign Secretary briefed the media regarding the BRICS informal meet which happened, and of course the meeting with the Saudi Crown Prince. Of course, at the BRICS informal meet, the big focus was on the issue of terrorism and protectionism. Even the joint statement has lashed out at countries who are supporting and providing safe haven to terrorist and terror infrastructure, which is indeed a big victory for India, given the fact that China is also part of this grouping. Other big focus for India at this summit, from the briefings what the Foreign Secretary had, is on the data flow, on how the data flows across international boundaries. And clearly India wants that any negotiation, any future pact should happen under the WTO, not by any grouping, including G20. So clearly that's a strong statement by the by India, and of course by the Foreign Secretary.
Right.
The meeting with the Crown Prince, the Saudi Crown Prince, was crucial because, remember, India gets its oil from that region and, of course, from Saudi Arabia, and the current tensions in the Gulf impacts India's energy security. So the energy security and the issue of oil prices were discussed with the Saudi Crown Prince, but not the Iranian issue on what the tensions between the Americans and the Iranians. Remember, the first bilateral the Indian Prime Minister had last year in the G20 was with the Saudi Crown Prince. This year, of course, this is not the first bilateral, but of course an important bilateral because that is a country that is helping India get its energy security in a major manner.
All right, so thank you very much indeed, Siddhant, for joining us and getting us all those updates. So it was a very, very hectic day earlier this morning. A number of different issues have, of course, been discussed. And thanks also to my